Tanzania's national debt hit $36.08 billion by the end of November last year, a $5.34 billion year-on-year increase from November 2020. According to the Bank of Tanzania, external debt closed at $27.95 billion, a $215.8 million drop from October, attributed to debt servicing payments outweighing disbursements during the month. However, the debt was still higher by $4.12 billion compared with November 2020. Debt service payments in November amounted to $171.4 million, of which $114.2 million was in the form of principal repayments and the rest representing interest. In December, the Speaker of the Tanzania National Assembly expressed concern about the borrowing trend under President Samia Suluhu Hassan. Analysts say borrowing is inevitable, but the money should be channeled to productive projects. The Tanzania Coalition on Debt and Development has also urged the government to empower Parliament to decide on which loans will be accepted and which will be rejected, working to improve on transparency and accountability in debt contracting. Today, we're looking at Tanzania's debt as it hit $36 billion. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope. Adeleru Balogun. Welcome. Joining me is Ali Khan Sachu, Africa geoeconomist and macro analyst. He's also the CEO of Rich Management. Ali Khan, welcome to Business Edge again. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with a bit of background. There seems to be some kind of line drawn in the sand regarding Tanzania's debt. Now, the Speaker of the National Assembly, who has now resigned because of his comments, raised concerns about the rate of borrowing under the current president. Is there really that much of a difference between what is happening when it comes to loans under President Samia Suluhu Hassan and former President John Magufuli? Is there a marked difference in their approaches?
So I think if you look at President Magufuli's term, it was a main feature was a fairly antagonistic approach to international lenders, a sort of background thinking that everybody period in terms of borrowing during that term. And I think what the new president has done is taken a much more conciliatory perspective on international multilateral lending, and has probably accelerated the borrowing early in her term, I think in part as a political decision, to be able to show that she's hit the ground running when she comes up for re-election. So I think partly political, following on a slow period, and I think the speaker chap was a Magufuli loyalist and frankly spoke out of turn, and I think she was quite right to get shot of it.
Okay, so now we've seen a growth in the debts from a previous stand of around $31 billion thereof. It grew $5.34 billion in 1 year to $36 billion. So what's Tanzania borrowing for? What projects are being financed? Let's take a look at that now.
So there's a bunch of stuff going on, but I would say probably the biggest borrowing is around the railway. They're looking to build an SGR railway to connect the East African region. I think there's an acceleration in electricity. They've had a lot of challenges. There's a big shortage of power at a national level, so she's looking to accelerate that as well. And then she got some money, I think, for support for COVID efforts. But overall, I think she's trying to accelerate the infrastructure side and put more money to work in the economy. And also bear in mind, okay, 5 billion, the optics looks big, but let me give you some quick background. They haven't rebased their economy for a long time. Therefore, the size of the economy, when you look at the number, is probably pretty undercounted for now. So, and the balance sheet has been very unleveraged. So I think there's a lot of room for her to do this borrowing. I don't think, she's in the spectrum of those countries on the continent who've overborrowed and oversplurged and are in trouble.
Okay, so government continues to dominate the external debt by borrow category, accounting for 73.4% of the debt, with multilateral institutions. They account for the largest share of about 44.1%, and then followed by commercial creditors. Who does Tanzania owe money to? This is a massive conversation on the continent, particularly depending on the issues, the standards, and sort of the concessions that each of these lenders will bring to the table. So who is Tanzania in bed with when it comes to their debt?
So they're in bed with multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the like. They have not embraced the Eurobond market, which is very expensive in comparison. So in that respect, the borrowing is well calibrated. And then they've got some borrowing on the basis of syndicated loans from the likes of Standard Chartered Bank. I think overall it's a well-managed borrowing profile. It is considerably less expensive than some of the other countries that have gone to the Eurobond market, for example, like Ghana, Zambia, which is now trying to bring it back under control. So I, for one, think, most multilaterals, most banks would still have good-sized limits available for Tanzania, as long as, the projects are viable, of which there are many that are very viable, in my opinion.
I want us to stick with this because, we've had these conversations as to the type of deals that African countries have been taking from whoever the lender is. So it seems like you believe Tanzania is going in the right direction and they are getting the best for their deals, for their loans. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I'm saying, they've been conservative in their borrowing until now. I think they've been much more sensible than some of the kamikaze type stuff we've seen. A good example today is Ghana, which can't now go to the capital markets anymore at the moment because it's so overborrowed. Zambia under President Lungu, that was another kamikaze type attitude. So absolutely. What I'm saying is that Tanzania is conservative. They've had this surge in borrowing in the last 12 months. But you have to look at it in the context of the rates that they are paying and from whom they're borrowing. And they're being eminently sensible in the way they're approaching things.
So let me add to this. So the governor of the Bank of Tanzania, Professor Florence Luoga, has said that the loans are sustainable and that there is room for more borrowing. He also noted that Tanzania can borrow up to 70% of its GDP. As it was in 2021, the debt is about 39.69% of the GDP that year. Do you think that 70% is really quite reasonable, even as conservative as they're being, as particularly choosy as it appears Tanzania is being? 70% of the GDP, borrowing that much, is that something that would be an easy burden for the Tanzanian economy to carry?
So, this is the other side of the trick, right? You can borrow as long as the investments you're making are going to be able to pay the borrowing and deliver you an adequate return on your investment. I think, 70% would probably be the maximum that I would be suggesting to them. But they've got some very big projects they need to get off the ground now, which will require very high capex. So, for example, the gas, which is in the south of the country, they need to tap that fast and get and basically square off their power shortage. They've got money that they can put to work in the agricultural sector. And I think, frankly, she's moving very quickly on the infrastructure side. And I think Kenya is not paying attention to what she's up to. Our railway's stuck in the middle of nowhere. Meanwhile, she's now connecting up Burundi. And before long, she'll be doing precisely what we should have been doing, which is connecting up DR Congo. So I think if I look at the big ticket projects which will require big ticket money, I think she's looking to take a big bite at those ones. That also includes upgrading the port at Dar es Salaam and probably putting a new port into Bagamoyo, but maybe not on the scale that the Chinese had proposed, something smaller probably.
All right. So while you seem quite pleased with some of the happenings, there are some who are taking more of a cautious note. The IMF has actually raised the country's risk of debt distress to moderate, and that happened in August 2021. That's going to be the next point of our conversation after the break, Ali Khan. So we'll talk about what Tanzania is doing. There are those who are just a bit concerned with where the country is going with its debt burden. The IMF raising that risk to moderate from low. We'll get into that when we come back, and also, of course, look into how the country can otherwise finance these massive development projects. Stay with us. Still with me is Ali Khan Sachu, Africa geoeconomist and macro analyst. Now, the International Monetary Fund raised the risk of Tanzania's debt distress to moderate in August 2021 from a previous rating of low. Debt service payments in November amounted to about $171.4 million, of which $114.2 million was in the form of principal repayments and the rest represented interest. Ali Khan, let me bring you back. Do you think there are risks? You seem to be happy. A lot of people seem to be happy with the decisions the president is making. But are there any risk to having a country such as Tanzania with a GDP around $62 billion having such a debt profile of this magnitude, even though, as you said, the country has not rebased and possibly the GDP is much larger than we know right now?
I estimate the GDP to be about 50% larger. I don't think they've rebased now for a number of years. With respect to the IMF citing them as moderate risk, bear in mind 20 sub-Saharan African countries are considered high risk. So a moderate risk, when you look at the spectrum of the continent, I think is not something I'm overly concerned about. The payment amounts that you mentioned, which was 112 or so in principal payments and about $67 million of interest. Look, I think, practically every single African country would be very happy to be paying only $67 million a month in interest. I think they would all consider it a bargain. Most of them are paying considerably more. So I think in that context, this is manageable. I think the challenge for Tanzania is to increase the tax collection and do that in a fair and very transparent manner. I think, that it became highly politicized, the Tanzanian Revenue Authority, and was used as a blunt instrument to beat anybody who did not, who was not in favor with the previous administration. So I think if they can normalize that, get people paying their fair share, and then, of course, grow the economy, then I think, this is all very manageable. In fact, if I look around the continent, Tanzania would be one of the more bullish countries as far as I can see.
All right, and I like the fact that we've sort of gotten into the conversation around other options that Tanzania may have, and that debate about the country's debt picked up and has now cost the Speaker of the National Assembly his job. He resigned in early January, but he also did suggest that the country look at internal revenue collections, like the taxes you've mentioned, as well as the mobile money levies that were recently introduced to finance development projects. Are there other more viable, maybe not more viable, but are there other viable options that Tanzania has to be able to add to this mix, so maybe they're not borrowing as much?
I think that, by the way, I think that mobile money tax was retrogressive and a mistake. And I would reverse that immediately. I think, with mobile money, countries just look at it and think it's free money and free taxation, and it isn't. For the average African, mobile money is a lifesaver. But, why are they taxing it at these very high rates? They should just let it grow and keep the tax much lower. So I disagree with that policy, and I think it's a policy error on their part. I think in terms of increasing taxation, the quickest way to do that is really to grow your economy, make your companies more profitable, and then they're quite happy.
So
So I think it's really about accelerating growth in Tanzania, and there's a lot of potential there. You've got enormous potential in the agricultural sector. For example, I would look at a more progressive policy on fertilizer. Look at ways you can promote agricultural productivity as one easy win. Tourism is a big option for them. They've got an incredible potential in that space, and then really becoming the transit state for this part of the world. I think Kenya's dropped the ball, and I think Tanzania has a very big opportunity here, which they've already captured to some extent with the proposed pipeline from Uganda to the port of Tanga, but really build on that strategy, because I think that will pay off big time in the medium term.
So the president has basically said no borrowing, no growth, but a lot of people are pushing her towards more concessional loans than outright loans. What do you think? Is that the right direction for Tanzania to go into the more concessional loan space than any other place?
Absolutely. Look, it's the space that all African countries should be looking at. I mean, the IMF, the World Bank have made plenty of money available at very low interest rates. We remain in a low interest rate environment. For how long, I'm not sure. Probably not that long now, because I think the inflation pressures are building in the Western economies. So really, this is the opportunity. If you're going to borrow, you should be borrowing from these multilaterals at these concessional rates, and probably maxing out as much as you can, avoiding the Eurobond markets at the moment, which are becoming very expensive. And then if you're going to borrow from China, which is providing 1/4 of all the loans into Africa at the moment, then make sure that the projects that you're investing those funds in are going to produce a return on that investment.
All right. So another issue that came up in this debate was about transparency and accountability. So the Tanzania Coalition on Debt and Development has urged the government to empower Parliament to decide on which loans will be accepted and which will be rejected. As it stands right now, it's the finance minister who consults with the National Debt Management Committee that decide how to borrow and what to borrow. Do you think this should change as we see Tanzania stepping forward more into this sort of debt conversations we're having?
So I think this is not a unique situation to Tanzania, and I would recommend all African countries look to create more transparency around their borrowing. This lack of transparency has been one of the biggest challenges for African citizens to hold their governments to account and make sure that there's no hocus pocus activity going on in the background. So I think, it's not only something we should be pushing the Tanzanian government to be doing, it's something we should be pushing all our governments on the continent to be doing. And I think, the more transparency, the more light we can shine on borrowing, the more we can look at the terms and conditions, the better loans, the lower rates, the better outcomes we're going to get as citizens. And ultimately, we're going to see more opportunity on this continent. But yes, I agree that the Parliament should have insight, a degree of oversight, but at the end of the day, the decision should still lie with the executive.
Okay, so I want to look at a few things that we see as potential for this year with Tanzania. A few gas deals were finalized in 2021. Gold exports accounted for about 44.1% of the total goods exported. That's around 2.81 billion for them, while exports of manufactured goods increased in value year on year from $894.8 million to $119 billion, thanks to more exports of cosmetics, iron and steel, plastic, as well as paper products. Is there a way that some of these things we're seeing, the development and the maturing and the increase in these exports, is there a way that they can help reduce the country's appetite for borrowing? What can Tanzania do to ensure that the borrowing doesn't become a burden on the economy and citizens, even though these projects are for the betterment of the economy in the long run?
So there's an enormous amount of potential. I mean, you mentioned the gold, that can be increased. A lot of the extractive side had gone slow because President Magufuli had taken a very aggressive stance and was not encouraging outside investors. And these are big projects. I think under the new president and under the minister January Makamba, you've got much more joined up policy making and thinking. We recently had the announcement of the investment in nickel, for example. There is a lot of natural resource in Tanzania, but the problem with natural resource investment is it has a long lead and a very high capex. So you might see more lumpy borrowing in the near term as Tanzania wants to maintain its participation in these extractive businesses, and therefore might have to put up some cash. There might be increased borrowing in order to start those projects off. But over time, I think they're going to increase those numbers you mentioned by a multiple, frankly. So a lot of potential. I think a conservative balance sheet, a lot of underlying optionality in the economy that needs to be unlocked. And I think a determination now by the executive, and what's more, an intelligent executive that understands what needs to be done, what messaging needs to happen, whom you need to speak to. And I think that is going to make a tremendous amount of difference for the Tanzanian economy.
Ali Khan, is it safe to say you're actually excited to see what the Samia Suluhu Hassan administration does with Tanzania in the next few years?
Absolutely. I think she's saying all the right things. I think she's doing all the right things. The only thing I would say is I would like to see a little bit more oxygen on the political side, allowing more freedom on that front. I think that's the last thing that she needs to do. But I can't fault her on the way she's spoken, the move she's made. I think she's very smart, and I think a lot of people are underestimating her.
All right, that means we're going to be keeping our eye on what's happening in East Africa, particularly with Tanzania. We'll be touching base with you throughout the year. Thank you so much, Ali Khan.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And it's good to have a bright spot with African economic news, especially with how many of the economies across the continent are struggling in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Could Tanzania really be that shining star for the continent this year? We will be watching very closely. Something else we're watching is NC4 to Watch, a few stories we want you to keep your eyes on. Stick around. And we stay in East Africa as we give you NC4 to watch. Top of our list is Kenya, where the new $246.6 million city that is being dreamed of has moved a step closer to reality. This comes after the Nairobi Metropolitan Service, in partnership with Kenya Railways, picked UK firm Atkins Global to design the project. The deal will see the firm design the iconic Nairobi Railways City, a multimodal urban development project which will be situated in Nairobi. Dubai has removed 5 African countries from its red list. They are Ghana, Angola, Uganda, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. The Emirates resumed passenger services to and from these countries on January the 13th. Kenya remains on the list. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries' monthly oil market report has confirmed Nigeria's production challenges. The report said that output remained below quota as the country's rig count dropped further in the last 6 months. It showed that Nigeria's production in December was lower at 1.19 million barrels per day compared to 1.27 million barrels per day recorded in November. And finally, the International Monetary Fund has said that public and private creditors need to finalize a debt restructuring deal with Chad by the end of March to restore durable growth and amid worsening conditions. Chad's economy and financial situation, as well as medium-term prospects, have worsened due to continuing shocks since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that wraps up Business Edge for today. Thank you for joining us. Follow us on social media. Of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel and download our mobile app. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru, Balogun. I'll see you soon.